Para comenzar esta mesa,
So to start this panel, in the first place, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to moderate this roundtable that deals with such an important issue. In the first place, I would like to introduce some of the topics that should be addressed in any discourse about blended voices in museums. I don't believe that all of them need to be addressed, but some of the most important ones should be identified. In the first place, we have the notion itself of indigenous and popular art and grassroots art. Indigenous art has different categories, not only aesthetic characteristics, but also conceptual characteristics. Indigenous art is a representation that violates the concept of the traditional concept of Western art. Modern Western art has been based on the premise that form is the main characteristic or the main or the key for defining art. So those functions that are secondary according to Kant, so I'm quoting Kant, but I mean the larger body of thought along these lines. So these thinkers thought that handcrafts, for instance, were lower orders and did not have the same stature as art. Now, if there is some kind of double discourse here, reading between the lines, when we talk about art, we mean a series of manipulations or playing with form, playing with shape, involving meaning and adding significance or intensifying meaning. So it is playing with the senses so as to increase or enhance the meaning or to alter or disrupt meaning. From that point of view, all different cultures or diverse cultures that do not follow the hegemonic Western standards are artistic forms. It's a moment in which they manipulate form. It's a poetic moment of creativeness based on a content of truth. This situation was enabled by the concept of contemporary art, which objects to the economy of form and opens it up to different systems that are not based on the significant hegemony or the symbol dictatorship, and it ushers in and claims access to what is beyond the realm of form in literary, storytelling, historical, psychoanalytical contexts, and also dealing with rituals, Yamanic rites, and interaction, ways of interactions that make up the sensitive body of a community. In general, indigenous art and popular art is in a situation, an underprivileged situation compared to mainstream art. So it is different from the notes that define the hegemonic culture, which is the market or consumerism form of art as we know it today. It also favors or promotes contradictions and differences and tension between alternative forms, producing significance processes. They are regardless or independent from those that are dictated by the state and hegemonic institutions. In the second place, we have contemporary concerns. Modernity is said to be a progress to the older, from the older to the newer. Contemporary notions are considered a series of time and lack of time with different meanings of time. So the timely and untimely aspects. I'm talking about contemporary. There is another meaning of contemporary, which means current or present day. A stage is a perspective. We may analyze the works of the Renaissance from a contemporary perspective or a current day perspective, and it has overlapping and different views. And there is also an exchange of views in museums. The indigenous art museums are not museums in the traditional sense of, or traditional meaning of the term. They are indigenous art museums, and this term is emphasized based on the poetic expression of works of art that are found in them. The interconnection of different disciplines authorizes and encourages the possibility of having a collection from the artistic point of view to host historical, ethnographic, political views. One of the characteristics of indigenous art is its commitment to the fabric of society. It is very difficult to extricate a formal aesthetic movement from an intricate pattern that has different readings and perspectives on reality. I believe that science can analyze and understand different moments, and art has the virtue of bringing about a poetic moment, that is to say, a moment of absence that is present in the work of art, that enlightens the darkness, the vibrations, or the invisible moments that are not shown. So a museum, strictly scientific in nature, tries to adopt the object, explain it all, say it all, and from an overpowering perspective, understanding the entire object. An indigenous museum works in a different way, in a poetic way. So it is favoring the possibility of having some absences, some gaps where other meanings are possible and not everything has been said or mandated. So resignifying objects and leaving space for objects to breathe and to tell us their own reality. I believe that that has to do with, in general, with the fact that in museums, once the formal autonomy has been abolished, and this happens in any contemporary museum and also indigenous art museums, how they call into question the moment of exhibition, the shine, the brightness of the object, or the manifestation of the object, how it is confronted with the information. The other position is to show the object without providing any thoughts, any documentary evidence that will never provide a complete description or contextualization. In indigenous art museums, it is fundamental to provide that evidence, because we would otherwise we would keep in the merely aesthetic plane without delving into the oppression that the indigenous communities suffered. There is a museum in Paris that has a primitive art collection, a so-called primitive art collection, that it is exiled into the past. It has no present and no future. It has been frozen at the best point, and all the clues and traces of belonging to a certain community have been erased. And it is standing on its own. It is dissociated from the colonization situation. Those objects have no context, have been decontextualized. So it is good to show the creative capacity in diversity and differences considered by indigenous communities, which were oppressed communities. And the last step in society, or they were at the lowest classes of society, but of course there is lack of orientation, and the challenge of contemporary art is how to achieve minimum form and aesthetic autonomy without falling prey to imposed contents. We also need to take advantage and capitalize other types of contents that have beauty and poetic value in their expression. I believe that in indigenous art we have that opportunity. The possibility is there, the opportunity lies there, and it makes the issue richer. It's a position that has to be taken regarding the autonomy of art that leads all contemporary art forms. The political aspect is fundamental in this arena, how to ensure participation and involvement on the one hand, and how to avoid the market logic on the other hand. So avoiding doesn't mean circumventing or not negotiating, or it doesn't imply the absence of trade-offs, but the idea is that indigenous art should be moved by self-determination and self-regulation. The indigenous groups should be the ones to define or to decide what has to be conserved, preserved, renovated, so that they are not excluded and they are not left aside as a matter of the past. So these are some of the concerns that I would like to share with you as a topic for discussion. It may be questioned or it may be denied, but it would provide some starting point regarding the topic of world blended art museums. So each of you has 5 minutes that have been allotted to your presentations. It is not my decision. It is the format of the event that has been designed this way. If there are any questions that deserve more time, we may address them in the Q&A session or in the discussion that will occur after your brief presentation. So we'll start with Janet. I don't know if I have pronounced your name correctly, but it is a beautiful name. It resounds, it's like too complex for a Western speaker, but I believe it's beautiful. So I turn the floor to you.
Thank you. I'm going to start by invoking invoking my language. Shakshi Klayets. Uklasish Janet Kwayakshish, Ahazit Aksuk, Nuchanos At, Mixu Stella August, Na Nixu, the late Ida Swan August Shish. Tatne is Ocean Wind Song, Teo Wind Dancer in Towson, Kavanaugh Windstorm. So I took a moment to invoke my language because our elders say, know who you are and know where you come from. And I don't know much more than that salutation because of the legacy of colonization in Canada. So I invoke what little I can. And I light a candle, as you can see on the PowerPoint, as a way to acknowledge our ancestors that are represented in our respective institutions. And I acknowledge the beautiful living Mother Earth, or Turtle Island, as we lovingly call it back home. I've asked time and again how to acknowledge the ancestral lands in this area, and it's a point of interesting conversation at the least, but I met someone from this territory recently this morning, and he said, acknowledge Mother Earth, because our ancestors are alive with us. So I acknowledge the earth that we are all so fortunate to be a part of. I do work at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. My name is Jeanette Kwayakshish. I have a career goal. I started out as a trauma counselor, and I moved towards arts education. I don't know if anyone's ever done counseling, but it's exhausting. So I shifted gears and went towards arts education. And when I was hired at the Royal Ontario Museum, I explained that my trauma counseling will add extra sensitivity to the type of work they wanted me to do at the ROM. And I set a goal, and I modified my presentation ever so slightly, that not only do I want to thaw out colonized minds, but thaw out and indigenize colonized minds. And I think that's important because even our own community has experienced internalized racism and oppression that's based on race, class, gender, and even religion. So I think it's really important to acknowledge it, not to romanticize Indigenous people as being uber spiritual or everybody in touch with their culture. I was raised in multiple foster care homes and raised by white people, and I've spent a good chunk of my lifetime always coming home because I was born into a colonial legacy, not by choice. I also work with in our museum, it's customary for Indigenous people to consult their elders when something important is happening in their lives. So when I told the elders I was going to get a job at, I was ambitious, but that I was getting an interview for a job at the ROM, the one elder, Wanda Whitebird, said, just remember, you're looking at ancestors behind that glass. There's no artifacts there because they were stolen from living cultures. And we celebrate that those ancestors were made for the unborn. And just because I might be 100 years, 200 years removed from what we see behind the glass, it's not just me as the unborn from the original source, but my unborn and my unborn's unborn, because they're imbued with meaning and our history and oral tradition. I also work in an institution that is officially 100 years last year, so we're 101. I think we look great. And I think that the ROM also has this dynamic history of working with Indigenous groups. So they've set a bed of coals, and I've arrived to ignite more community engagement and authentically work with Indigenous communities so that we are representing a diverse group of voices. We have more than 70 distinct nations in Canada, 633 communities, and 40 to 60% of us live in the city. So there's a lot of effort to keep our culture alive in public institutions that can be one medium to make that happen. I also have had the good fortune of pulling together an Indigenous Community Advisory Committee, and because I work within the Learning Department at the ROM, all of those folks have links to education in some way. They could be classroom teachers, curriculum develop folks, writers, elders, people from the Métis community, where it's a really simple way of saying that is mixed blood communities, mixed heritage, and also folks that work in classrooms. So at one time, the ROM used to believe itself, commit itself to being a world, like a world-class tourist destination, and that mandate has changed very quickly to the ROM connects visitors to the world and each other. And that's also to appeal to the local community engagement work that we need to do to be able to sustain our attendance at the ROM. So a little bit about myself. My job is made possible by the Slate Family Foundation. My name, as big as it is, translates one who gives away and still stands tall. And I waited a lifetime for that name because not everybody knows, including Canadians, that our art and our language and our cultural expression was outlawed between 1884 and 1951 under the potlatch ban. So when I was interviewed by the radio and they would not say my name, I had it legally changed because I think it's important that we invoke our ancestors, and it's a very meaningful name to me. I come from a place called how's it, and I playfully say, how's it going, so people can wrap their tongue around a word they might not have heard before. And I am a proud to call myself an arts educator. I also keep my traditions alive as a cedar bark weaver. I do beadwork, I do textile art, as you might notice from how I dress, and I'm a proud mother of a soon-to-be 22-year-old, one that's already turned 14, and one that's soon to be 7, so this baby needs to be updated already. So for fun, this is how you say my name, AyAy. And I have an Indigenous Advisory Circle community members that are filmmakers, Métis, educators, as I mentioned, folks that visit the ROM quite regularly, a youth representative, an elder. We also have someone from the Ministry of Education, which raises our profile because we have the mandate to include Indigenous content at every grade level. And we also have curatorial on staff, which also plays to the legacy of the leadership role that ROM plays in engaging Indigenous communities. I have staff training, and I get paid just enough that my workmates have to take my training, and it's an important time in our history for us to create a balanced perspective on what happened in Canada, to look at ongoing contributions of Indigenous people through a contemporary lens, and also making it a learner-centered experience so that we experience experiential learning. Indigenous education training is based on those principles, and we also have the opportunity right now to develop an Indigenous colonial timeline. We just had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wrap up collecting testimony of residential school survivors in Canada. And just to give you some context, my mother was born in 1945, and she was stolen from her family when she was 7. Just to put that in perspective, you know, it's not just a black and white photograph. There's heartbeats attached to that experience. So out of that colonial timeline, we're not just going to talk about what hit the fan historically around, you know, what colonial experiences happened to us, but balancing that with Indigenous accomplishments, successes, and contributions. And professional development opportunities are vital because while we're mandated to include Indigenous content, our mainstream educators don't have that backdrop. So I also play a leadership role outside the ROM as a co-chair of one of Canada's largest school district. We've been able to get the school district to acknowledge the territory formally with a motion that was passed. We also got them to pass a motion to actively hire Indigenous educators, like mandate that they hire Indigenous educators. And also we're looking to get them to send another motion to acknowledge the ancestral lands every morning in every school before we sing O Canada. So we're playing a leadership role, and as we get closer to 2017, celebrating Confederation, we have important responsibilities to acknowledge those territories. I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to hope that you might have read some of the outreach that I do. But what I want to acknowledge is that professional development is vital. We also have youth leadership opportunities that the elders want it to be inclusive. And I'm here today because Americo and I shared a panel in Cardiff, and I think they were impressed that I was talking about Indigenous people as living cultures, that the ROM has a track history of tackling difficult truths, and my hire represents pushing that envelope further. And museums need more color to represent the diversity, and we also have to avoid memories being selective. So I end by lighting all these candles to acknowledge all of your ancestors if they happen to be represented in our museum collections. And I also value the support of the Maktusis Huli Society for helping with some partial sponsorship, the Slate Family Foundation, the Canadian Museum Association, and Canadian Heritage. Happy to talk to you more after. Chu. Shakshi Klayets. Chu.
Bueno, ahora vamos a escucharle a AyAy Colombino del Museo Arte Indígena de Paraguay.
Our next speaker is from the Indigenous Museum of Paraguay, AyAy Colombino. The Indigenous Art Museum is part of the Mud Museum or Earth Museum of Paraguay. It is not just the Indigenous Art Museum, it is within the framework of a bigger museum, because you will see some photos of the exhibitions.
Hablamos en esta mesa lo que nos proponían era.
So the proposal for this roundtable was to talk about recovering the past and inserting the past in the present. When talking about the past, I don't think it is wrong to do that and to associate it with the indigenous communities, but I believe that it is a serious problem to always link it with indigenous communities, because it is like dissociating them with a historical process of construction of community. So the question would be how to insert the present in the present. How to insert the present with its wide-ranging variety, with its multiple ways of expression, the conditions of existence and production of a cultural element, an object, or whatever it is. That's why I talk about inoculation, inoculating the present in the present. The inoculation of the present in the present or the past in the past raises some issues. There is a case I've worked with in an area of Paraguay. It is a Chihuahua ritual in the central Chaco area in my country. There is a similar culture in Argentina and in Bolivia. There are similar communities. This is the exhibition room. Unlike what Jeanette was saying, this museum was created or built with the representation of the different indigenous communities. So we have the human form, a seismic image in Latin America, provided by a network that has 50 or more people working on it. This exhibition was opened at the Reina Sofia of Madrid museum. It's a contemporary art museum, and it traveled to different cities, Lima and Buenos Aires. It was also shown at the UNTREF in Buenos Aires, the university. So in the cultural field, my proposal was to inoculate the present in the present, or the near past in the near past. So to put on display a complex show of this indigenous community. And this ritual has a meaning for articulating an indigenous art view, as Ticio Escobar has mentioned. This show had nothing to do with a traditional art exhibition. It was problematic for the network that supported it and also for the Reina Sofia Art Museum at the time when it was proposed, because it was disturbing. It disrupted thought about contemporaneity. Indigenous art, I started thinking about this. Indigenous art will never fit in the contemporary art paradigm of hegemonic museums. So it provides another reality. It is a confrontation of two types of contemporaneity. We believe that contemporary should deal with more or less similar topics, but current indigenous art provides imbalance, and the certainty is lost. Now, elite art has a different kind of exhibition. It is problematic, and it is healthy to include the problematic issues. I believe it is important to have some disruption, to have something that is out of the box, something that has nothing to do with the current paradigms and that will knock down the current structures. I know that it makes people uncomfortable, but I believe it is necessary for achieving balance. Even though there was a special area for the exhibition. We decided to display, you can see a point on the left, which were disseminated masks. These masks had been distributed at different points of the rooms. The masks were representing an ambiguous presence that makes people uncomfortable, a presence that is not fully understood. It is like a parasite. I work with the parasite notion a lot. The parasite relationship occurs when the parasite is not welcome. Nobody wants a parasite in their body. Nobody welcomes or prepares a place to host the parasite. The parasite attack the open wounds of the traditional notion of art or the historical view of art. The transcultural masks of an indigenous culture are looking at the art of a European museum and other traditional museums or elite museums. This could be considered a ritual in itself. When Western society, indigenous art can show us that a museum is like a Western rite. It is an emptying of the space and time to look at ourselves. And what Ticio Escobar wrote in his book, he described the Tovich, which is the Ishir ritual circle. It is the house of the verb. It is the venue of the myth, but also the waiting room. Here you have songs and prayers and masters of ceremony. You fast and you eat in a ritual. You learn about purification and silence. You work on memory and forgetfulness. You suffer severe ordeals to strengthen your body and your spirit and to reach wisdom and share it.
Bueno, vamos a escuchar ahora a Sven Haakanson.
Let's listen to Sven
The Burke Museum de
Haakanson, who comes from Burke Museum, United States.
Chimai hui gasochmit I suchbiat. Hello, my name is Fish, and I am suchbiat. Before, I want to share, and I know I have a lot of slides to share with you, and I only have 5 minutes. I want you to take away from my talk the power you have with understanding your museum collections and what they mean for us as indigenous peoples, and what each piece embodies. You were talking about art, and to me, our art is an embodiment of our worldview, our way of life, and how we express it and care for it. It's not just art for art's sake. But I'm going to be talking about curating cultural landscapes through unwritten histories within museum collections. And each of you has that power to help our indigenous peoples not just change, but also use and understand to empower them to make healthier choices in their lives. I write, our history, past, present, our responsibility. In order for us to be able to understand who we are, we have to know where we come from. We also have to understand our history. I come from a place where we were treated as uncivilized, primitive savages. And that was even growing up in my own lifetime, being discriminated against because of my skin color, because of where I grew up in a village. Well, how do we change that? Understand our history. We go read through what Captain Cook and his men came. They were the first ones to actually write about us in English. I'm going to read this one here to you. This is one of Cook's officers. He wrote, "Through we descended down a ladder made of a thick piece of wood with steps cut into it, into a dark and dirty cave seemingly underground where our noses were instantly saluted with potent stink of putrid fish scattered about the house. We were welcomed to these murky caves with the master of the house and his wife and other females sitting together in one part of the hut. Having been used to these many strange scenes since we left England, we spent no time staring about us with vacant astonishment, but immediately made love to the handsomest woman in company, who, in order to make us welcome, refused us no favor she could grant, though her husband or father stood by. The women were raped right in front of the men. They were demasculated. And we've been taught this for over 200 years. We have no ability to stand up against what was done. And we keep passing that on, whether we realize it or not. And that's the scary thing with understanding that. That was a drawing right after that scene. I really appreciated this drawing because it has so much information ethnographically. But to me, it became a crime scene of what happened, what we were living with. And these are historical accounts of what happened to us, all of these things that continued, yet we're still here today. I had the privilege to be part of digging up a site where the Russians took over Alaska in 1778 or 1784. I grew up in a village, and the village on the bottom left or right-hand side is where I grew up. And we still practice these traditional ways of life. We live this way where we are Christian now. We run multi-million-dollar boats, multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar corporations. We celebrate 4th of July. Well, how do we change that? How do we stop us living and passing on that knowledge? I was involved with creating a program through a museum I used to run for 13 years, the Alutiiq Museum in Kodiak, where we created these different programs. Instead of having the museum in town in one place, we took the museum to the communities. How do we get that knowledge to where it belongs? Where, you know, that knowledge of knowing but living, where it becomes part of their lives. How do we create camps that celebrate the stories, the fishing, the dancing, the language, all of that was stripped away from us? How do we change that? By bringing that knowledge to a living context, creating our own exhibits. To the other thing that happened during the colonization, all of our objects were taken and spread across the world, in Europe especially. One of them in France, he collected over 70 masks. I worked with the museum there, and we translated his journals to get these songs to bring them back. Up until 10 years ago, we weren't carving very many masks. We weren't telling stories through masks because we were told they were evil. They were bad. But when you read these, old man, where is my helper? Will I find him down there? Who should I take the catch to? It's not about what we were told, worshiping evil things. It's about how do I bring food to you so we can sustain ourselves. So those masks have stories. In France, we created these products, books, workshops, so we can bring it back to the community. We put that stuff back into a living context. Working with museums in Russia, working museums in Peabody Museum at Harvard, where we're discovering new things that we had no idea that existed. We found a double-bladed paddle. Within a month, we were having our carvers making those double-bladed paddles that we didn't know existed until 2011. Spoons, dances. But the one thing I want you guys to think about is the power of what you can do with museum collections. If you look at the boat and where these gentlemen are standing, that bulbous bow, this is science. And as I was doing research, I realized these boats are pretty amazing. But these boats disappeared from Kodiak by the 1850s. They were gone. We had no idea they existed. I searched the world. I found some diagrams. I found written notes. But most of the collections are models. There's 13 models that exist around the world of this boat. That's it. Models. No full-size ones, no big ones. So looking at the museum collections that were dug up in the 90s, I found at the Burke Museum, they had a model. What I did is I sketched it out, blew it apart, made kits, so that I can then go and work with the community where the village of AyAy last year. We made 13 models working with kids, young and old, where we built these boats. But we taught them about engineering. We taught them about this bulbous bow, which is pretty amazing when you think about the fact that there was no models like this except in museums, and we made 13 last year for the first time. Well, let's take it the next step. This summer, we built a full-size one. So we now have the first full-size one that belongs to the village in AyAy. We had 3 generations of people, children, adults, elders working on it, where we have learned to build a boat, but our museum collections are living because of the knowledge embodied within each piece. Shows how collections are relevant and important to our communities. The past and present knowledge is living, and that repatriation of knowledge is not objects. Each piece is unwritten written history of our culture past. And that was the result from this summer, as of 4 weeks ago. So using museum collections to bring lost knowledge, but empower the community to understand how not just amazing they were, but the knowledge that is embodied within each piece, and that change you can make. Instead of considering themselves, oh, I'm just stupid, they can't say that. Because this bulbous bow, I found out from a colleague that the military designed a bulbous bow on the boats, the large boats you see, from a dolphin. We had that for 1,000 years on our island. When you tell a young adult that, think about what you do for their lives. Instead of having, oh, I can't do it, wait a minute. If our ancestors had that, why can't I do it? So using collections to make those changes. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias a los participantes.
Thank you. I would like to thank the speakers. And
Lo primero que
hearing what you had to say, the first thing I would like to mention is the difference in indigenous art. Not only because you exhibit or put on display pieces that have different sensitivity and art, because these are also related to community memory, community practice, community sense and usefulness. In some cases, the community builds site museums, and those are the ones that have more meaning regarding the social subject that questions their own memory. Those performative effects that Sven mentioned, how are they related to contemporary art? How to act upon reality? How to reactivate processes that seemed dormant? How to convoke memory? For indigenous, there is a political issue that is also interesting, that has to do not only with self-determination, but also with self-esteem. We are capable of creating alternatives, cultural and artistic alternatives, and civilizing alternatives, particularly, which nourish contemporary diversity. And all of us need this to survive. We know that biological, natural, and environmental diversity has a counterpart in cultural diversity, and they support each other. So these are forms that enable us to build alternative ways of thinking and living that enhance the menu. I apologize for using such a trivial word, but they enable us to understand the world's diversity. Bartolomé is an Argentine anthropologist that lived with the Guarani people a long time, and they said that whenever an ethnicity is extinguished, a civilizing project is lost. So the food habits, the erotic habits, the language, the aesthetics of that community is lost. And that is enormous loss in terms of the diversity of culture. And we are running the risk of becoming a single culture and losing. Culture arises from friction, from differentiation, from contact, alliances, reflections. If there were a single culture in the world, it would not be a culture. There would be no differentiation of the different communities and human groups. So I believe it is very important. On the one hand, as Leah was saying, the right of contemporaneity of indigenous communities, not looking at them as things of the past, not considering them as things of the past. They are at the present time. As Haha was saying, it's also important in the sense of recovering the historical inscription, which is traumatic for us in the Western world, how to process our past, going back to our ancestors to recognize and acknowledge a process and a place in that process. And it configures a religion, so to speak, not a religion in the Christian sense of the term. It is a factor of community cohesion and understanding. And as Sven was saying, the fact of going back to past practices and ways of living that are still valid today, and they have resounding value in our community to reinforce the pride and identity of the communities, understood not as a finished thing or as a thing of the past, but as a continuous process of construction, a construct, a subjective, determined construct. So if the panelists have something else to add, this would be the right time to do so, and then we would go to the Q&A with the audience.
I wanted to thank Sven for bringing up the image of the Nootka house, because that's my territory. And I have to say I have a lump in my throat, because I know that you acknowledge that as a crime scene, because I see those same images in the research I have access to. And I think it not only, I mean, we're talking about art in one sense, but when you unpack that rape scene, what you have is a legacy of indigenous women, men being demasculated, but indigenous women being sexualized and eroticized. And that creates a modern link to the epidemic of missing and murdered women in Canada. We have more than 1,500 women that have gone missing and murdered in the last 15, 20 years. When you show up with boatloads of men without women, that's problematic. I'm not just a good-looking indigenous woman, and neither is my daughter. But it doesn't make us a target to go missing or murdered. So I think it's important to contextualize how history minimizes and looks down and puts down, and how that narrative carries over, and what kind of responsibility do we take to interrupt that. So I wore a dress today, which is my art, and it's about butterfly, and butterfly is the gift of potential. It's being able to change from one to another, and we have a volunteer in the audience who's going to share with you some origami. It might not be indigenous, but we can learn from each other's cultures. I've made more than 100 origami butterflies to share with you today, because my name means one who gives away and still stands tall. And our gift giving, our art, our gifting culture represents you taking this away as my payment for you to remember what you most need to from today, not just from what I said, but what we've all said. And I also had a kaleidoscope in the audience. If you want to take a quick look through that, I hope that at the very least you come away from this session seeing the world just slightly different, that indigenous people have the integrity and ability and tenacity to speak for ourselves and collaborate. It's not that we want to dominate and take over museum culture and ways of doing business, but we need a more balanced perspective and be realistic that indigenous people are a problem historically, and we did not go away. Because I know in my heart of hearts, one of our elders has a phrase that says, "This day belongs to me. Thank you. If you don't get a butterfly, I have more that I've made just in case.
Sí.
Good afternoon, everyone. Buenos tardes. Good afternoon, presenters. Thank you for your voice.
Buenas tardes a los presentadores. Muchas
Talk about indigenous art, or we often are referring to art made some time ago, and I wonder what is your thought on opening up the concept of indigenous art for contemporary makers? Is that a part of the conversation in your communities? I'm curious.
I'm glad you brought that up. I'm trying to remember. I think it's Michael Yolangas, who's a Haida artist, and he's definitely a contemporary artist. He does manga, so he does a fusion of Japanese, like cartoon image, like manga, like a graphic novel. So that's important. And he's also published his book, and his publishers hate to hear him tell people to cut the book up, but if you buy 2 books, it opens up to one big piece of art. And then he told his publishers they'll have to buy 3 books because then they want to keep a bound copy. But the other is he says he makes his art big so you can't miss it. So he makes it out of steel and like you can't move it. It's so big. So we have the Ontario College of Art and Design University, and there are huge graduate numbers coming out of there doing contemporary art. So it's everywhere. I mean, we're contributing all the time. In music, in dance, in theater, we have genres. I mean, we didn't get the right to go to university in Canada till the 1960s, because that's when we got the right to vote. But we do, from there, have abilities to contribute, and there's lots of evidence, and I'm sure at a museum you know that as well.
Buenas tardes.
My question is for all of you, but based on the experiences you have shared, and also based on what she said. We are a blended community. You have the possibility, because you live in Paraguay, to be close to indigenous communities. I live in Córdoba, in central Argentina. I don't have that possibility. But I have been a weaver, and I also wanted to recover our past, the past of our communities, and the oral traditions. How can we prevent the oral traditions from being lost? I have read Ticio's books and Juanacha's books, and I have been researching. So my question for you in Paraguay is, how or where did you find more rejection of your exhibition? I tried to show what the blended community is doing. That is to say, artists that are doing contemporary art, but with textiles and ceramics and ancient techniques. So how can we present in a conventional room something that is unconventional? And how can we provide something that is not empty or devoid of content? So, and how to include the ritual in this. Specifically, in this case, the entire exhibition had to do with poetic, political moments that cut across the art notion in Latin America in different situations of repression by the state. It had to do with a specific point in time. So, on historical grounds, all cultures have had their expressions, their cultural expressions, and those cultures have been violently colonized. In Paraguay, the case was that because some spaces were remote and some rituals were remote and far away, they were isolated. They were not lost, but they were reconfigured, and indigenous communities have re-signified certain matters, keeping their structure. And this represented something for the people in these communities. So there is nothing to be recovered or redeemed. They were the ones that redeemed their own or recovered their rituals. So we always talk about activism, and from an urban perspective. In many of the indigenous communities, I have found activism because they have resisted to cultural disappearance through these performances, which are very powerful. Rejection to the museum exhibition has to do with the fact that people don't understand what that is doing there. They don't understand that a ritual can be read from a contemporary perspective and from an artistic perspective, because it is generally shoved away into the past, as if the past, or as if contemporary art had nothing to do with the past and thousands of years. So we all come from the same origin. So it was hard to share this. You know that all shows in the world today have people that pay for them. So those spaces, those institutional spaces, need to justify, to provide a rationale of why we are showing something or why something stands there. So my work or my challenge was to clarify the contradictions that institutions suffer. There was no way of leaving this episode aside. So how this is understood, so you go into a room, you see a mask there watching you. So it is like people didn't know what to do about it or didn't know what to think about it. It was a confrontation. So until they got to this smaller room where we showed not only the masks, but also other artifacts, and there were photographs. And most of all, the pivot of this was a short documentary that we shot with the Chiriguano community through one of the wise men of the community, a musician. He is the keeper of the music for the ritual. That was very important to keep this ritual alive. That is how we did it.
Ria, a mí me parece-
I think it's important to understand statistically, English and other European languages love their binaries, us and them, right and wrong, civilized, uncivilized, but it also organizes our relationship to time, then and now. So in academia, we can call that space in the middle erasure, and Christians call it the sin of omission, and it serves the same purpose. If we don't talk about it, it didn't happen. When it comes to how we express ourselves artistically, I think we get stuck in this notion that we're only frozen in the past, like you referenced the museum in Paris about primitive folk. And what I want to add to this is a storyteller I was talking with Sven about over the time I've met him is Terry Tafoya, and he very passionately said every tradition was once brand new. Every song, every dance, every ceremony, and if it was for the good of the people, it would stay. And if it was for personal gain or greed, it would be lost, or it would not be repeated And so there's room for new tradition. Don't just think of indigenous people in the past tense. I'm here, I have a heartbeat. Ask me who I'm becoming, not who I was and who my family was. Who am I becoming? Who are my children becoming? Because I am not frozen in the past. I wear nylons from time to time. It still makes me indigenous. At my heart, I have a heartbeat. I bleed red. We have a rack of bones. And at one point in our evolution, we all had to huddle around the fire to keep warm. So how do we now, fast forward, think, harness some of that traditional knowledge that can still guide us in a good way in the future, but how do we work collaboratively to see whole people, not fragmented pieces of the past?
I believe that the topic of the crossing of the contemporaneous and indigenous culture has at least three perspectives. First, the sense of what is contemporary. The contemporary is no longer considered as a evolutionary and procedural theological linearity that goes in one direction, but rather a rupture of times and the possibility of talking about many contemporaneities, like many modernities. There is a single modernity, which is the hegemonistic Western modernity, which is the modern. The rest is pre-modern or parallel modernity or a different modernity, etc. But modernity is one, whereas contemporaneity is many different things. Because being contemporary is like placing oneself in my own times, how to discuss, how to struggle with our own times, which is what art does in a way. Art is anachronic mainly. It's not following a time, but it is leading or dealing with its own times. So there is a matter of contemporary times. Contemporaneity. It's still in force and it continues to produce today and it continues to make sense and have something to say. I have an experience similar to Lia's where I was a curator of the Valencia biennial exhibition of contemporary art. I took ceremonial pieces of indigenous art, which are pre-Columbian, but they continue to be made today. But these are contemporary pieces because they are made today. They are, if they are enforced today, they make sense for the community. It was provocative, but it was a way of proving a thesis. So they are contemporary. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there is an illustrated contemporary look on other ways of looking at the world, which feed from that perspective. It's a matter of perspective. It's taking a diagonal view, going across the entire history and thinking about Renaissance art in a contemporary way. But also, there is an issue that has to do with contemporaneity as something related to certain forms that incorporate the anachronic world, that have a broken view of time, incorporating diversity. So these are contemporary works. They continue to be made today. They are still in force. So this gives a dimension of contemporaneity. There is a complex issue. To what extent do you discuss that in an indigenous community? Well, some communities discuss this and other communities don't. The term art is not always present. These are things that are applied from an illustrated view. And finally, there is a way of doing contemporary art in the illustrated sense of the term. The first indigenous contemporary art biennial done in Mexico, there was illustrated contemporary art that was displayed. videos, installations, photography, artifacts, accounts, all this menu of current contemporary art. It was absolutely interesting to see a number of videos and photos because they entail a different perspective many times. Indigenous people will tell a story through a picture. As Jeanette was saying, it breaks the dichotomy between a documentary and fiction. A indigenous woman was asked to tell stories, and she cried and laughed. She represented and threw away things. She invented. She did a number of things because she was telling a story. She was telling an account that incorporates fiction as a way of better telling the story of a specific ethnographic group. The indigenous, the other, enriches, and it is a critical part of the concept of contemporaneity. It's not that after modern times, contemporary times started. Here we are talking about a perspective that goes across modernity itself, and it can entail a perspective of effectiveness, of anachronic and broken and circular times, or forms of recovering or rereading the past, and forms of considering what the past brings to the present.
To my co-panelists, it's customary, as you can tell by my name, that I do give away. And in our culture, we have the tradition of being able to acknowledge the good work that you're doing here, and being able to then move forward. Oh, can you hear me okay?
No.
We have to keep that? Okay, so I want to, I don't have anywhere to clip this, but I want to wrap everybody here with my love and appreciation, and take that energy with you in the good work you do as a way to continue the good work, and feel that your work is very vital to the work that we need to accomplish as Indigenous people, and the work we're doing to represent each other in our museums with more respect. So I want you to keep up the good work, and thank you for being a part of today.